Alright, stop me if you've heard this one.
The Rings of Power was a massive flop and an embarrassment for Amazon Prime. Only 37% of people who started watching the show ever finished it. That means it lost 73% of its audience. Now, I don't want to get off on a rant here, but I haven't seen a bomb this bad since the Chicxulub impactor took out the non-avian dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous period. Okay, babe?
You've probably heard or seen that claim dozens of times from some of the people on screen right now. I got a comment like this on every single one of my recent Rings of Power videos. But of course, like everything the people on screen right now say, it is a lie. Stay tuned. Hey folks, I took a little break after dropping my long overdue Defense of the Rings of Power playlist. It was a lot of work and I just needed a little mental vacation. I did notice a certain kind of comment turning up in the comments section of almost every single one of those videos though. The claim that the show was a massive flop and that only 37% of its audience actually completed the first season. This claim appears to have been recycled from this Hollywood Reporter article, posted April 3rd, 2023, which says that Rings of Power Season 1 only had a 37% completion rate. It cites unnamed sources as verification. And that's common enough practice in investigative journalism, but come on. No one's life is at stake over this. Can we be a bit more transparent here, Kim Masters of the Hollywood Reporter? This 37% figure is more than a little unclear, especially to people with any training at all in statistics. Does 37% refer to initial viewers, meaning only those who started watching the first week of the series? If so, that would not account for people who began watching the show after the first week. Does it refer to the first 90 days? To the lifetime of the show so far? And 37% of how many initial viewers? With a large enough initial audience, even a 37% viewership retention could still be a massive amount of people watching. Whatever the case, the usual suspects ran with the narrative, and a thought-terminating cliche was born. So now, the 37% meme turns up in almost every comment section, Reddit, Twitter thread, or any other online discussion about Rings of Power. It's typically used as a rhetorical cudgel against anyone expressing any kind of appreciation for the show. The implication being that if the show was any good, it would have retained more viewers, and there must therefore be something wrong with the cognitive faculties of people who like the show. I've had my suspicions about the veracity of this 37% claim for a long time, but the frequency with which it was thrown around even in my tiny comments section made me decide to dig a little deeper, and it turns out the picture of the actual viewership numbers for Rings of Power is a bit more complicated. But as you are about to see, whatever else it may have been, Rings of Power was definitely not a massive flop. The easiest way to see this is to look at the metrics of the show's performance while it was originally airing. We do have data on this, and it tells a very different story than the popular 37% narrative. In the interest of brevity, I'll just summarize the data while putting graphics and screenshots of articles on screen. Feel free to pause this video to look at or read them in more detail, and the articles will all be linked in the description. Now, the popular thing to do when Rings of Power's first season was releasing episodes on a weekly basis was pit it against HBO's House of the Dragon Season 1, which also released its new episodes on a weekly basis within the same window of time. The usual suspects, who you see on screen right now, made a lot of hay out of Rings of Power's viewership numbers performance week to week when compared to House of the Dragon. They liked to say that House of the Dragon was slaying Rings of Power in the ratings, picking up new viewers every week while Rings of Power lost viewers every week. And that was true until it wasn't. You see, Both of those patterns reversed over the course of each show's first season. Rings of Power recovered about halfway through its first season, regained most of its initial viewership, and finished with a bang, while House of the Dragon peaked about halfway through its first season and began to somewhat decline in viewership after that. Here's a graph from Nielsen showing the streaming performance of each show during the time they aired parallel to each other. You'll see that even accounting for its decline in viewership over its first 4 weeks, Rings of Power had overall higher streaming viewership compared to House of the Dragon every single time, except the week of September 19th, 2022. That was the week that House of the Dragon aired episode 6, which featured a 10-year time jump and the introduction of a bunch of new actors, essentially a soft mid-season reboot, a functional second pilot. A logical place for the show to pick up a bunch of new views. After this spike in views, however, House of the Dragon never beat Rings of Power in the streaming ratings again, and, as you can see, Rings of Power began to recover viewers, finishing up its first season finale as the number 2 most viewed show of the week of October 10th through 16th, 2022, while House of the Dragon finished at number 4 that same week. In fact, Rings of Power experienced a surge of viewership on October 15th, 2022, the day after its season finale dropped. According to Parrot Analytics, this eruption of new viewers rocketed the show to a height of being 55.7 times more in demand than the average show in its market, finishing at second place overall, according to Parrot's metrics. Only House of the Dragon did better under Parrot's metrics, with both shows earning an exceptional rating, the highest one Parrot gives. House of the Dragon's better performance here was likely due to the fact that it aired on linear television as well as on streaming, while Rings of Power was available only on streaming. And that's the caveat to all of this. The usual suspects here held up House of the Dragon as the superior player, while hiding the fact that this could never have been an apples-to-apples comparison in the first place, because the two shows aired on different schedules and different platforms. It was a great way of lying with statistics on their part, as was claiming that Rings of Power lost viewers every week and then hiding the fact that it reversed that trend in the back half of its first season. The facts are pretty clear here. Once the effect of linear television on these two shows' performance is controlled for, that is to say, if we make a fair comparison and look only at streaming versus streaming, the data bear out that Rings of Power was the clear viewership winner. It may not have dominated social media or office water cooler discourse like House of the Dragon did, and it clearly wasn't the immediate cultural watershed that Amazon hoped it would be, but by the metrics available to us, it was by no means a flop. And there are 4 more seasons ahead, so there's still plenty of time for all of that to happen. Lots of iconic shows didn't hit their stride until later seasons either. And Amazon has essentially infinite money, so they can afford to be patient. Meantime, what are we to make of this claim of a 37% completion rate? To be honest, I don't really know. As I pointed out at the beginning, the Hollywood Reporter article is too vague to really make much sense of it. But even if we take it at face value, it's still incredibly misleading, probably the reason that the usual suspects like it so much. If we wanted to synthesize the 37% claim with all of the other data I've presented in this video and in the links in the description, the picture would probably look something like this. Rings of Power attracted an enormous initial viewership with the release of its first 2 episodes, but a lot of those initial viewers decided to wait until the entire season was available, then came back the day after the season finale dropped to binge watch the whole thing. And by the way, None of this says anything useful about the quality of either show. It's perfectly acceptable to prefer one of these shows over the other, even to hate one and love the other. They have very different themes, aesthetics, and sensibilities, so we'd expect them to appeal to different audiences in different ways. I personally love both shows, though I slightly prefer Rings of Power over House of the Dragon, but only slightly. In my opinion, they're both excellent in their own ways, and both masterfully execute the visions that guide them. If all of this data is new to you, it might be worth asking yourself why the sources you rely on for entertainment news did not tell you about it. Why would all of these people you see on screen right now go out of their way to hide this from you? What do they have to gain by lying about a pair of fantasy TV shows that most audiences seem to have liked? Why do they think your loyalty to them matters more than the truth? I'm not here to try to convince you that you should like a show you don't like. I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong or stupid or soy or degenerate if you disagree with me. I am comfortable with difference and diversity. These other folks right here? Not so much. And honestly, I think that's pretty sus. But let me know what you think down in the comments. Appease the great god algorithm with likes, subs, and shares. And until the next video, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women. Shanti, Salam, Shalom.